Hi everyone, and thanks for being with me. I'm going to talk today about domestic violence and its impact on Indigenous women in particular, based on a coroner's report that came out recently, which I think we all need to take note of. In this report, it indicates the lack of attention that is paid in relation to domestic violence in the Northern Territory. And I'm about to quote primarily from an article in The Guardian which talks about the coroner's response to an inquiry made into domestic violence in the Northern Territory and the death of women at the hands of their partners. It often seems to me that we tend to ignore Indigenous affairs around many of these particular issues, and it is regretful, and it is sad for me that so many of the issues that we're combating in our society, domestic violence in general, and domestic violence Indigenous people in particular, seems to be ignored, pushed aside, not seen as relevant as perhaps the deaths of white people or other people. That's unfortunately is a sad indictment on our community. So I'm going to take us to the article in question. And here it's a Northern Territory family violence response found lacking after inquest into tragic deaths of 4 Indigenous women. So the coroner, Elizabeth Armitage, says she hopes that 35 recommendations will result in long-term change and lives will be saved. She says all 4 women reported fears of their safety to authorities or loved ones in the weeks, months, and even years before they were killed. Their killers had histories of family violence and were known to police. The recommendations included that the Northern Territory government should fund a peak body to tackle family and sexual violence, increase investment in alcohol and drug rehabilitation and the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, expand a specialist family and sexual violence court, commit to developing alternatives to custody for perpetrators, and increase its core baseline funding for crisis services. The Northern Territory Police were also told it should commit to a significantly expanded and appropriately resourced domestic, family and sexual violence command in Alice Springs and Darwin, which would be headed by an assistant commissioner and include permanent positions and a training unit that would ensure the force was aware of best practice in response to this issue. So clearly, in her view, there was an issue around best practice, and that means that not enough supervision has been made around the way that police and others were responding to domestic violence in that community. She goes on to say, these deaths were senseless and shocking. They also were preventable. We must bear witness to the suffering of these women, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Couldn't agree more. We must feel incensed by the deaths, the preventable deaths of anybody, and amongst Indigenous community in particular. They must not be forgotten, and their suffering must not be ignored. It must compel us to action. We must not take the radical action needed to stop more. We must not take the radical action needed to stop more women from dying. Armitage found that rates of family violence in the Northern Territory were far higher than in other Australian jurisdictions. She found, and I think this is really important for us to know, she found that in 2021, the rate was 3 times the national average and 5 times that of most other jurisdictions where data is reported, and that the rate of related homicides was 7 times the national average. In Australia's worst jurisdiction for family violence, Aboriginal women were significantly overrepresented. Armitage also found the problem was getting worse, with Northern Territory police figures showing they recorded a 117% increase in the number of family and sexual violence reports over the past decade, and predicted a further 73% jump during the next decade. This is unless we do something about it. The Northern Territory Police spends almost half of its entire policing budget on the issue. So clearly there's something drastically wrong. It goes on to talk about the shocking rate of Aboriginal women being killed as a result of domestic violence in the Northern Territory has largely been met with silence from the broader Territory and Australian communities, and a persistent, inadequate allocation of resources to address the complex issue. And I guess my point, as we're looking towards, this is day 10 of my 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, is that we need to be more mindful of what happens in other communities, apart from white communities. That the Indigenous communities in particular need a lot of resources, and not just the resources, I think. They need better training, better engagement with their communities. They need better professionals who understand what's going on. They need people to stop judging their communities. They need people that actually care about what's happening for Indigenous people. It is shameful. And our response, the government's response, has been pathetic right across Australia in relation to this particular issue. And it's something that we must do something about. So let me know what you think by subscribing to my channel, ring the bell for further notifications. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.